Isquis Chichawasket, Pamela Barnes. It's my honor today to formally welcome you to the Syilx territory. And so before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us. In this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, the sharing of our lands with peoples from other places is fairly recent. It's about 200 years. Where other parts of Turtle Island, that history goes back 500 years, 1,000 years, depending on where you're speaking of. But here it's fairly recent. And with those coming together of different peoples from different places came some new ideas about human relationship to the land, and that are very different from our traditional viewpoint about our relationship to the lands. And so one of those concepts is the idea of ownership, human ownership of land. And we as Syilx people see ourselves more of borrowing these lands from our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. We look at things in 7 generations. And there's a very big difference between those two ideas. So if I own this necklace, I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away. It's mine, I can do what I want. It's up to me how I choose to care for it. I can take great care, or I can toss it aside. Again, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. If I borrow this necklace, everything changes in those relationships. I cannot sell it. I cannot trade it. I cannot give it away. And there's an expectation that I take the very best care possible. And when I leave it or return it, that at least it's in the same condition I found it in, and if at all possible, in better. So those ideas are very different. And it's with that understanding of our relationship to these lands that we first welcomed people to the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx people. And so it's with that understanding that today I welcome you to the traditional unceded and currently occupied territory of the Syilx people, with the gentle reminder that none of us, including ourselves as Syilx people, are taking the very best care possible of these lands for all of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Limlim.
Wai limlim. Kulun chutun kan wist. Tali khastis puus kana lab. Apanas khalkhald. Wai tskitski khayat nakhul. Wai kuts tu wilch. Tali khasti ikal yayatstim. Ikal marimston. Ikal siur. Ikal stiltsal. Ikal skwankl. Yatstim wai khulal. Wai skepchamul. Kekamis Cha'ak Miku Taku Otikal Temhula Kukaus Witsum Kukaus Tikum Tia Yatstim Tali Hastis Puus Kitskala Utlut Hanum Jutnik Hui Utlutak Hanum Tali Hastis Puus Tluwikinson Apanas Khalkhalt. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to say a few words and a little prayer. Oh, I'm very, very happy that you have arrived here today. All the things that we do in a good way. At this time of year, it's springtime, and our people are going to go on the land and collect medicines and dig roots. And that's going to turn into summer. And then summertime, we're going to pick berries and go on the land and enjoy the land. The land is very beautiful. And it don't matter if it's raining or sun shining. The land is beautiful as we are, as you are. And I'm glad you got here safe and sound and that you return home to your home safe and sound. Thank you very much, my friends and relatives. Limlimt. Thank you. Have a good day. Wait.
Okay, well, I will get started with my introduction and then I will hand it over to our lovely speaker this evening, Ericka Walker. All right, so welcome everybody. As you may know, I'm Victoria Burge. I'm the Education Coordinator of Adult Programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and staff, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us. I will begin this evening's talk by acknowledging that the land on which the gallery stands is the unceded traditional territory of the Okanagan Silks people. Now today, the Kelowna Art Gallery is pleased to introduce Ericka Walker, the artist behind our current exhibition, A Decaying Fort and a Lack of Guidance, which will be on display in our Reynolds Gallery until July 11th. Her print works and site-specific murals are designed to subvert the function of propaganda found in the nostalgia of contemporary culture and questions the civilizing influence and assumed moral authority of nation building in North America. Ericka Walker received a BS from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MFA from the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. She lives and works in Nova Scotia, where she is an assistant professor at NSCAD University. Walker exhibits widely throughout North America and internationally, with pieces housed in multiple public and private collections. She also won the grand prize at the 2018 Okanagan Print Triennial, which is why we're so excited to have her here with us. And she was longlisted for the 2019 Sobey Art Award. Okay, so just before I hand it over to you, Ericka, I just have a few housekeeping rules for all of our guests. We will have the chance for a Q&A session at the end of our talk and studio tour. So just hang on to your questions until the end of the talk and type them into the chat menu below. As always, I'll do my best to get to as many as possible in the time that we have allotted this evening. And it's important for me to mention as well that today's lecture will be recorded for future viewing. So if you know somebody who might want to check this out at a later date, it'll be up on our YouTube and website. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoy the talk. Ericka, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. And thanks everyone for showing up all across Canada. I just peeped at the participants list. So there's even maybe a US person I know in there. Yes, thank you so much for hosting me. And yes, the Okanagan Print Triennial. The grand prize means you're stuck with my work now for a couple months, but I couldn't be happier. I was able to put together an exhibition during the pandemic and get it framed and shipped out there. And I've never seen it all together, I've never seen it framed, but I'm really excited to hear if any of you in attendance have been to that exhibition. I'd love to hear what people think. But my talk here for tonight, let me just, oh wait, I've got to share my screen first. Hold on a second. And if I cut it out really badly, it's going to, like if it's to the point where you actually lose important content, just holler. Let me know and I'll backtrack if I need to. Can you see that first slide? Okay. This talk, I probably take me about 45, 50 minutes, maybe 45. I'll try to keep it to that. And then I have some things in my studio I want to show you that I'm still working on. And some tidbits that'll help make some of the lithographic work that I'm going to show make a little bit more sense. So that'll be a first for me. I haven't attempted too much show and tell with Zoom yet, but I'm hopeful. The title of this talk, I couldn't decide. I like to title my talks based on the mottos of the provinces or states or universities where I'm speaking. So British Columbia's provincial motto is "Splendor without diminishment." And I apologize, I didn't look into the backstory of that. I like to try to do that a little bit too. But Kelowna's motto is "Fruitful in Unity." And as you'll see in the next half hour or so, I'm really, I get a little excited about these kinds of mottos and attempts to encapsulate the essence of a thing, particularly a very national or provincial ideal of a thing in these slogans, in these statements. So I grew up on the traditional tribal lands of the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi. These were lands that were ceded to the US government and governed through dozens of land cession treaties stretching out over multiple decades in the mid to late 19th century. And this land is also known as Wisconsin. I currently live on Kijipanupek, near Chibuktuk in Mi'kmaq, and this is a region which was never ceded to British or French settlers. This place is also known as St. Margaret's Bay, Nova Scotia, in Atlantic Canada. And I'm a settler. I'm a daughter of colonialism. I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. I'm also other things, but this is a good place to start for a presentation about my work, which deals frequently with the presence of the nation state and questions around national identity and ideas of patriotism. So if I refer to people or use the word, if I refer to my people or use the word our, I'm referring to those of us with white settlers as ancestors, white European settlers, particularly sons and daughters of colonialism. For this talk, I'm going to end with a small discussion about the work that you might see in the Kelowna Art Gallery, but first I want to introduce you to the work that's been my primary practice over the last 10 years. The next half hour or so, I'll talk about these large multicolored lithographs and how they come to be, maybe why they seem relevant to me. And I'll start with a kind of a boring 30-word description that is really painful to write, but all of us artists have to do this kind of thing constantly, like 30-word artist statement, 200-word artist statement, fit your whole career into 2 sentences. But it's a good place to start this talk, I think. I'm interested in invoking, through emulation, the visual, textual, and ideological vocabulary of Western integration propaganda in service of exploring generative and destructive birthrights and questioning the difficulty and complexity of honoring heritage or progress. So lithography was a process that was perfected in the early 19th century. It's still used frequently today in both commercial and artistic applications, though the technologies we use are extremely varied. The version I use involves a lot of repetitive labor. In 2009, I began making lithographic posters that wedge themselves somewhere in between French philosopher Jacques Ellul's definition of the 2 types of propaganda. In his definitions, the first, integration propaganda, which aims at convincing people of the beliefs of the benefits of adjusting themselves to desired patterns or ways of thinking. And this is often state-sponsored. And the second is agitation propaganda, which serves the purpose of inciting rebellion. So between these 2 opposing modes is a space in which persuasion can't effectively exist. And so my work has been described that way, as occupying an absurdist space or an odd liminal space where the very function of a poster, which is to deliver a clear message quickly, is entirely crippled. So without its ability to perform as expected, this opens up a platform to reconsider and to attach new meaning, hopefully, ideally. So in this work's best moments, when a viewer realizes that they're not looking at state-sponsored propaganda, nor are they looking at an anti-war piece, there could be a search for meaning, an attempt to connect the image and the slogan. And if I'm really lucky, people may see that although the vehicle and the aesthetics have changed over the years, the strategies used in propaganda have essentially stayed the same. For example, so the amount of allegorical illustration has been dialed back, but the same sentiments are being evoked here. The language is similar. What they're trying to incite in us is the same. And I think it's easy to dismiss 19th and early 20th century propaganda, particularly the printed matter and the posters. And you see this a lot in pop culture when you see ironic recontextualizations of funny old posters. And one can like easily think how ridiculous that my grandparents actually, believed in this, that this actually functioned, did it work? But if you pause and imagine the contemporary version of this persuasion, it's really not so different. Cornel West was an American philosopher, activist, scholar. Maya Angelou is an American poet and civil rights activist. Both of these minds have leveraged the idea that we can't really move forward until we look back. And if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And that's a philosophy I tend to operate with pretty frequently. So all of these images, there's historic and contemporary. We have a World War I poster, and then contemporary Canadian recruitment posters. These are all about rousing people's emotions. They're attempting to incite generic attraction to belonging to something big and noble and adventurous. The only difference is the poster on the left is hand-drawn and overtly racist, but it's British, right? So it's civil. Technical gear and stoic masculinity equates with heroism. These examples cater more to the indomitable individual spirit while linking up with a noble cause. Staring with great confidence into the void, apparently the mark of a real leader. So prior to making these lithographic posters that I started in 2009, as a student who studied print, I had been attracted to very different genres of printed matter. I'd been looking at commercial and state-sponsored graphic art from the mid-19th century onward. And alongside those works, I've been just as attracted to and interested in the prints and posters produced by organizations and individuals that decry injustice, expose the horrors of war, artists who've been working to liberate folks from oppressive regimes and corrupt economies. And these works can be seen to exist on opposite ends of the spectrum, and in many respects they are. However, many of the illustrative and textual strategies used in these works are attempting to seduce and compel us by poking at similar nerves. And I'm trying to poke at those same nerves. But in my case, my objectives aren't clear. And that's kind of the point. So the contemporary versions of these works are the photographs and video clips that make their way to our news media and all of the fluff media that orbits around our social media sites. So images of imperiled refugees, the victims of genocidal wars, our noble troops, whether photographic or hand-drawn, contemporary or historic, agitation or integration, images are still very much put to work. Often their intentions are to define shared identity within a community or population, or to evoke sympathy for others by showing us our shared humanity. So speaking of shared identity, in addition to looking at graphic art, when we're able to do things in the world, I also watch, visit, and participate in a variety of orchestrated efforts used to galvanize enthusiasm and loyalty for the groups, clans, regions, and nations that rural white-bread folks like myself might identify with. So places and events where regional and national pride are exhibited in good faith. These are the events that have shaped my childhood and my early worldview. I do balance these with experiences in other cultures, but those aren't my stories to tell. So these are my people, and I'm in a good position to critique, explore, and even lay bare the culture of my ancestors. My conviction has it that we've come to this place of dominance and depravity. The sociological complexity involved in mobilizing propaganda and the artistry of national pageantry have been constant interests of mine. In addition to their economic motives, the motives and outcomes of these feats are dubious, intricate, and sometimes actually educationally very valuable, or truly rich, or at least well-intentioned. I've seen so many muzzle loading rifles loaded and fired into the air. I could probably do it with my eyes closed. I've averaged a national historic site visit per month for the last 10 years, even during the pandemic. And sporting events, similarly, the Super Bowl, the Stanley Cup, the Olympics, all of these involve grand orchestrations for the purpose of evoking national pride. I tend to avoid the sporting events, though. I can't go that far. What bothers me on a regular basis is just how susceptible I am to these displays. So when taps is played at a funeral, or an inauguration speech, or seeing a fluff piece of journalism about Joe Biden at the tomb of the unknown soldier, or Carrie Strug vaulting with an injured ankle. Those of you who aren't American don't understand the significance of that freaking story for us. It's unbelievably, I'm not even gonna try to explain how that lodges itself into hearts of people in my generation. And the image on the left is, my grandpa is in there somewhere. And it kind of hacks me off, like faces of freedom. And what does this mean? What does that even mean? My other grandparents also made grave sacrifices that didn't involve blowing people up, but they don't get the same kind of attention as Mani got during his lifetime. And for most of his life, he was used this way in regional media as a symbol of the great generation. And I don't like how it reduces him to a symbol that allows us to go on feeling fuzzy about this idea of the ultimate sacrifice, whatever that means. But I'd also be lying if I said I wasn't proud of him. So there's this tension between my intellectual and critical response and then my emotional response. And that's been a really interesting place to make work from. In some ways, the work that I make is an attempt to unpack the myths that surround my family and families like mine. In addition to using my work to ask those kinds of questions about my family narratives, I also use the studio practice as an inroad to fill gaps in my education. So I'm not a history buff. I've always wanted to be. I don't seem to retain that information as well as I'd like to either. So I use this work as an attempt to connect in a more meaningful way to the events that have shaped my circumstances, and in a way, hopefully to connect to current events as well. So a lot of the pieces, they all have some kind of backstory, and I'm not going to go into the backstory for each of the prints, but they often have some kind of historic component, and then a contemporary kind of twist or a parallel. So I don't know, for 8 years or so, I began most of these works with a machine of some kind. So in graphic art, machines are often stand-ins for progress, ingenuity. In my work, the machine represents a technological triumph, a turning point, a massive failure, a contentious investment, a harbinger of a grim or brilliant future. For instance, this piece is derived from a multifaceted story of human achievement, which is often shrouded in a very romanticized past. So long story short, after the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, Germany wasn't allowed to collect, store, manufacture, or design weaponry of any kind. They were reduced and demobilized as prescribed in 51 articles of the treaty, articles 159 through 210. So there was no article that forbade the research and manufacture of rockets. However, the Nationalist Socialist Party provided German scientist Wernher von Braun the opportunity to research his dream of pioneering space travel. So they funded his research into rocket propulsion. Von Braun's work was militarized as the V2 rocket, and when the first explosive device landed in London, he's quoted as saying, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." So after the fall of Germany to the Allies, von Braun turned himself in to the Americans, who happily provided the former Nazi scientists with laboratories, money, and he eventually helped us win the space race, speaking of overwrought displays of power. So a lot of the work, a lot of these posters especially, kind of capitalize on these stories where, maybe something kind of from an engineering standpoint, or from a altruistic standpoint of the individual who engineered the thing. There was this grand hope, or this beautiful dream that ultimately was twisted and perverted. This story with this piece is fairly similar. The engine pictured here is this first successful turbojet engine, the Junkers Jumo, which was also a World War II German invention. It powered the first operational jet fighter, the first operational jet bomber. And the text also, it's taken from a kind of two contentious sources. There was a poster series produced by the Nationalist Socialist Party during World War II. And this particular quote is often attributed to Franz Kafka, but the original Nazi poster attributed it to a 19th century German writer, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, because Kafka was Jewish, so that wouldn't work. Regardless, the cracking of nuts suggests a wide array of interpretations, from the crude to the existentially challenging. And what I like about this piece, and the last one that I didn't notice until maybe a year or so after making them, was that even though I rely on these very masculine tropes of solidity and certitude, many contain elements of impermanence and decay, or the feminine, or fertility, nature, or even growth. So the image and text here serve to denude that masculine thrust, in this case of jet propulsion, exposing instead a decidedly feminine or chalice form. If you look back at this other one of the rocket engine, it's not a phallic symbol at all, even though when we think of rockets, of course, that's the most obvious phallic symbol, isn't it? This is more like a big pregnant thing, but it's also exposed, it's vulnerable, it's dented, it's aged. There's actually a student of mine that helped point that out to me, which is why I love working in institutions. You don't have to be, I can't believe I just said that. You're not kind of on your own in your own little dwelling of your own thinking. Anyway, so an important part of this work is my engagement with the sources of the text. Even though about probably 0.1% of the documents I read end up as slogans in the final work, every hour of that reading feels very significant to me. So I read and listen to a lot of government reports, historic speeches, policy documents. I read anti-war poetry, listen to patriotic songs, then I memorize patriotic songs. I sing them to my child. I've read the 9/11 Commission report, large parts of the Pentagon Papers, the US Declaration of Independence many times, the Monroe Doctrine, the Montreal Annexation Manifesto, the Canadian Armed Forces Policy on Sexual Harassment and Discrimination, Lyndon Johnson's phone conversations, letters to relatives in the old country from female homesteaders, letters from service members back home, Lockheed Martin and Irving Industries mission statements and annual reports, and numerous treaties between the Crown and Indigenous people, and the journals of my family members and the writings of my father. And I've discovered that political rhetoric has changed very little in 200 years, and I've learned that the experiences and words of individuals, all their hopes and anguish, have been shaped by those documents and policies, but almost never the other way around. Big surprise. The text in my prints is, taken directly from these sources, and their content has been shaped by them as well. Early when I began this poster work, I began exploring the development of contemporary agriculture and the agricultural revolution that helped propel settlement on this continent. And I began learning about the threads that connected agriculture with the military-industrial complex and with the imperial and colonial aggression that helped shape this nation state, both nation states of my home country and my adopted country. I learned too about my family and how they took part in this chapter of the great experiment of liberty, as I call it. My dad's side farmed, and amongst other things. And so there's more of that tension, the tension between my pride in my family and the cost incurred by their presence and their progress. And as a mass white bread kid from the Midwest, the history of my family and the majority of my peers has been and probably will be for a while, steeped in a world full of stories about our history, some of which are a little bit one-sided. These stories come to us as accounts of fortitude, ingenuity, and bravery, and this is not untrue. They contain also some of the ugliest manifestations of progress known to the world. For example, the way we grow food. It is a grand and enormous feat. It requires immense sacrifice on the part of those who provide. It involves amazing technological developments. Contemporary agriculture sustains us, and many practices are also destroying the environment on many fronts. So again, those binaries, this tension. Agriculture is a particularly complex one that deserves, it's maybe not as sexy as some of the other conversations around climate change, but contemporary agriculture is at the core and ought to be at the core of those discussions and the way that we think about our activities at home, our decisions. So Mount Rushmore, it's not really on the same level as agriculture, but also maybe represents some of these multifaceted, tension-ridden stories. So it's 95% ridiculous, hilarious, offensive. It's a desecration, but also 5 parts impressive, maybe, especially if you've seen it. Like, it's massive. The Calgary Stampede also is, that's my Canadian equivalent to Mount Rushmore. It's a weird stretch, I know, but there's something culturally significant in these things. I'm not suggesting that we spend a lot of time redeeming these things. Rather, some of us would do well to see the complexity of the larger picture that these things represent, to understand more of the context behind how they came to be and how they came to be national treasures. Another example, the settlement of this continent on an individual familial scale for those that settled was a harrowing experience that required resilience and fortitude that I think we can easily honor our ancestors for. But the way they came to immigrate here and the expansion of their populations was made possible by settler colonialism, which is inseparable from colonial genocide. So these parallel threads of shamefulness and integrity are this awkward platform on which I place my work, or at least oftentimes from where I began the work. I don't know that it always resonates in the work with people who view it, but that's often where it begins. Holding multiple conflicting truths is a challenge that most humans tend to avoid, including myself. And I think this reluctance is where misunderstanding and ignorance and harm stem from. I don't think my work can encourage people to hold a lot of conflicting realities. I would love it if it did. It's good to have goals, I think, as a visual artist, even if they're pretty far out there. It's good to reach high. So I think these 2 pieces that maybe are a diptych, and I think they're about 2 different types of power, or maybe 3 or 4 different types of power. The text is taken from some contemporary Canadian Armed Forces recruitment slogans and perhaps asks us to consider how we regard that type of persuasion, which is not unlike contemporary car commercials that wax poetic about the kind of person we endeavor to be without saying anything about the actual vehicle. They could suggest that a sufficient place from which to look at these ideas is a vulnerable one, where we begin by admitting that we don't have all the answers, that we have more to learn. It's also inspired by a $1 billion defense budget that funds F-35 stealth jets that defend Canadians' Arctic, even though they don't operate well in cold weather. We have the same problem in the US, like times 100. Curator Jessie Bryant writes about this work, and there's just a little segment I like to read because she says it better than I do. Binaries course through text and image in You Are Needed. That's the name of this exhibition from a couple years ago. Beyond the thematic coupling of animal and machine, violent and bucolic, and individual and institution, we discover other underlying dyads, such as that between strength and insecurity. Underneath the bold semblance of power and perfection lay tinges of vulnerability, which leaks through in words like loss, question, demobilized, and reduced, and in the unusual pairings of slogans and images that evoke inquiry rather than certainty. My most memorable exchange about my work was with a student. Is that true? Yeah, I think it was the most. I think it was the most impactful. Um, yeah, exchange with someone outside of my my graduate school cohort, right? Which is always such an intense, intimate group. This student told me that he saw the work at an exhibition in a local exhibition that he had seen, and he actually looked up the phrase "now I'm become death," and he found the backstory very moving. The phrase is heard in a public address by J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is the lead physicist and scientific director of the Manhattan Project. After the world's first test of the atomic weapon, the Trinity gadget, Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu said to Krishna, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." My student read further into Oppenheimer's involvement and expressed to me his surprise at learning of the scientist's second thoughts about the atomic project and the eventual denial of his security clearance. He then watched a video of Oppenheimer delivering this speech, and my student remarked, "He looked so sad. I've never, ever heard someone sound and look so heavy." This young man was visibly like shaken by this story, and I had been too. That's why I made the work about it. The quote from the verse appears again in Kubrick's movie Full Metal Jacket on the helmet of Animal Mother, a character that can be taken either as a simply misogynistic, bloodthirsty lunatic well within his element, or perhaps one iteration of a scared young man being gobbled up by the war and intent on masking it. And so these are two approaches to handling discomforting realities of our own making. Oppenheimer eventually seeks vulnerability in its face, and Animal Mother shoots at it. The second piece of text in this work was a sentiment proclaimed by a number of the others that witnessed that first nuclear test, saying it was like a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The pairing of these two statements offers a reflection on the incongruous nature of these kinds of scientific discoveries, to the inventiveness and determination of the human mind and spirit existing in tandem with its equally commanding ability to destroy. It's also the title of a book about the Manhattan Project by Robert Junk, as well as the name of an Iron Maiden song, which is also about the atomic project, and includes lyrics like "Join the race to suicide." So the problem with posters and with all political rhetoric and propaganda is that they're designed to provide us with the framework with such certainty and emotional conviction that we don't trouble ourselves to learn any more than what is provided for us, to learn that these problems are centuries old, that their origins and solutions cannot be encapsulated in simple slogans, and that to start digging out of the messes we find ourselves in, we will have to engage in uncomfortable work, and we'll have to hold truths that seem incompatible. So this poster work continues currently. I'm working on a series now that I might have if I have time or the chance to show you a little bit of. It's often in a series of like 4 to 12 at a time. So this series here from 2016, 2017 explores parallel stories between British, French, American, and Canadian mechanizations that represent progress and power. The railway, the moldboard plow, firearms. The ghost figures are appropriated from graphic artworks and political cartoons that shaped public opinion in support of these industries. These are the two I'm referring to here. They show up here. That lady's back there. Connecting Canadian and American colonial expansion and imperial aggression has been an interesting process. Canada doesn't have a huge torch-bearing woman, but it does have guided missiles. It does have a landscape carved through with railroads and plowed furrows of earth. And it does have a history of firearms that, while not as entrenched as America's, did provide the necessary force for the mounted police and soldiers to overpower the original inhabitants in the Métis Nation. When I talk to Canadians about this work, I've noticed either a buzzing enthusiasm about also drawing parallels between us, and also a real reluctance on behalf of white settler folks, especially to see the parallels that their nation state's history and that of their bombastic, violent Southern neighbors. And I think that kind of absolution through relativism is really alluring. I get it. I think we all do it with like our actual, like literal neighbors and friends, but it's lazy. And in this case, it's a type of social negligence, really. So a friend of mine sent me a text message about this work that he saw in an exhibition, and I really liked it. To quote him, it has the vague, purposeless slogan that suggests responsible and sensible management of limitless material, time, and space, with the work hard, play hard absurdity of a white guy in a funny hat proving himself on the back of some livestock. In this related series, I'm looking at some of the implications of living on territory governed by treaties between the Crown and Indigenous people. The forces that have shaped this continent for me and my predecessors, from the creation of highways and railroads to resource extraction and massive power generating projects. These manifestations of progress have been created through or by my government by way of treaty rights, sometimes in spite of, and on behalf of supposedly all of us. The object behind the cowboy here, the Cowboys is a direct appropriation from a poster for the Calgary Stampede in, I think, 1978. And the machine behind him is a Francis turbine, and the turbine design that's also used in the James Bay project, which is a huge hydro project on Cree ancestral land, and the text is language from Treaty 9. So each of these pieces includes a piece of machinery that represents hydroelectric projects, mining, forestry, logging, industries that can be seen as economically stimulating, sustainable, and job creators, important, especially in economic depressed regions, but also gross violations of the environment and the people who rely on it. So when I travel across Mi'kma'ki, when I flip on a light switch, when I purchase land, I'm essentially exercising a treaty right. And so I'm part of this equation as a beneficiary and not a bystander. And that was something I really appreciated when moving here, was that understanding myself also as a treaty person was not something I'd ever thought of growing up, on Ho-Chunk or Potawatomi territory. But my colleagues here at NASCAD helped me to understand that. Canada's mid-20th century nation-shaping project was also largely supported and illustrated by graphic art. So initial efforts to graft an image onto Canada as a vast uninhabited landscape in need of rugged European stewardship can easily be found on the posters and advertisements of the recent past, along with many other Canadian ideas and ideals like that of a hardy, brawny, but responsible masculinity, adventuresome determination and resourcefulness, heteronormative patriarchal families, the right stewards for this land. So whether in advertisements or iconic national treasures like the Group of Seven paintings, territory and wilderness are shown to exist as pristine or pastoral sites, an inheritance for us, a gross simplification full of omission. But the seeds of stewardship, which is a really important concept, are there, but in need of a lot of reconciliation. But go back to hydroelectric power for just a minute. It's astoundingly massive, impressive. It's renewable, but across the globe, the created floodplains that are a necessity in hydro dams are continuing to swallow up the lands of Indigenous people and poisoning water supplies. And I believe in every single province and territory in Canada, this is a truth that is alive and well. BC is no stranger to massive energy generating projects that seem to be tone deaf to the energy needs of the regions that they want to support, not to mention the sovereignty of the original stewards. So Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador is already 5 billion over budget, billion, not million, is crippling local economies. And to keep it fairly simple, it's come into direct and warranted conflict with the Inuit and Innu people of Labrador, who have an attempted or sorry, an apparent interest in protecting their water supply and hunting grounds in order to use their traditional foods and hence maintain their cultural identity, to put it simply. So the trend here, resource extraction, agriculture, industry generally, are the literal carving out of our destinies onto this continent, and others like South America especially. But the colonial era didn't end when we had successfully settled everywhere that would sustain us. But these projects are actually the continuation of that endeavor. So the land claim agreements, or what are called modern day treaties, ratified in 2008 between the Inuit of Labrador and the federal government, are not just documents that govern Aboriginal people, they govern all of us that live in these regions. So once Muskrat Falls gets its act together, it was supposed to be last year, I believe, I'll be the beneficiary of treaty rights when I draw on the electrical grid, because we will eventually be receiving a large portion of that energy from Muskrat Falls when it's complete. So these compositions combine the impressive and awesome design of the Kaplan turbine, which will also be used at Muskrat Falls, with text from those 2008 land claim agreements, so they can be seen to exist together as powerful forces of progress, or perhaps mismatched solutions that coexist as if some monumental calamity forced them together. The use of treaty language is an attempt to isolate some of the often sterile and magniloquent language that governs Canada's relationship to territory. These founding documents, as well as illustrated and written propaganda, marketing language, and political rhetoric, are bedfellows that have prepared my place on this continent for good or for ill. So obviously, it's important that I look at these realities and consider my place in them. And so I've read what others have written about this work, and I'm speaking about it now, and I've had some good and semi-interesting things to say. But I don't know, that these studio artworks forward the work of settler responsibility. I don't think that they're doing a bang-up job of that in any way. They seem to be a continuation of past work, though through another lens. And there's more here for me, and I intend to revisit this work, or at least these topics. But as with the other work, an attempt to develop an intimate understanding through studio practice of these forces that shape my life. I'm just conscious of the time, and I have a couple other projects I want to talk about. So if I don't get to go back to this, I paint on barns sometimes. These aren't mine. But this is probably, I really don't want to skip over it, but there's so much that I want to say about it, and summarizing it would be difficult. Maybe in the Q&A, if I don't get back to this, if someone wants to ask about it. Yeah. Okay. I love this project. So
Go ahead.
okay, I'm going to do it. So the responses about my work that stood out, that I think are really the most impactful for me, other than that student I mentioned, were those of the son of a lead engineer on the B-24 bomber, or a Navy veteran who spent 9 years of his life both devoted and disgusted, or the farmer who began in the 60s when he was a young man with pride and love for the smell of soil, who's now conflicted and remorseful about the changes that he has to make to keep up with the market and what the Sobe industry demands of him. But there's something also really just really romantic and nostalgic about this. I grew up around a few barns and silos with these paintings on them, and there's something thrifty and charming about encountering them, because they're using something that already exists in the landscape instead of erecting something new that only serves its own purpose. They become a landmark in a way that people identify a region. They become a source of local pride. And I thought, well, geez, this seems like the logical extension of my poster work. Agricultural themes and problems are constantly an interest of mine, so I need to get myself out there. And to keep really long story short, there was a graduate student at NASCAD that just happened upon my office one day. I can't remember what, I think she was seeking me out to ask a question about something else. And I just randomly told her about this idea I have to paint on barns. And it just sort of clicked. That happened to be the right connection. This graduate student, Jessica Winton, connected me with the Uncommon Common Art event that happens out in the agricultural valley of Nova Scotia in Kings County every year. It ran for, I don't know, I think 12 years or so. Anyway, they hooked me up with a barn, and I brought an assistant with me, and we spent, wow, I spent like 4 weeks straight, 7 days a week painting on the side of this barn. I had no idea what I was doing. And I made some pretty tight friendships, and I learned a lot. And every 20 minutes, a local resident would stop by to chat, and we'd talk about art, agriculture, technology, labor, how chicken shit is processed. And my assistant, Sarah, and I learned extensively about organic farming practices. A lot of local people ended up helping us. It's just basically a large paint by numbers affair. And most importantly, I felt like I was making something for others instead of something that I would be in possession of and in hopes of exhibiting in the right scenario. Yeah, there's a lot to say about where the text comes from in this piece. It was this woman, Amelia Johnston Weatherby. She was the wife of an orchardist in the late 19th century. And we erected a sign, I believe it's up now, for this piece, just to give local people some context. And it reads as such: Amelia Johnston Weatherby was a creator of home and sustenance, a friend, mother, wife, aunt, grandmother, and resident of Kings County. She gave her family and her community support and stability. The labor that women like Weatherby provided during the formative years of European settlement in Nova Scotia can be looked on aside from or in alignment with the work of the horses, tractors, farm laborers, and moldboard plows that tilled this region. However these concepts and images are read by viewers, their impact on our lives is indelible, even if it is not always visible. The moldboard plow particularly is a very really influential. Essentially, we would have not been able to move west and sustain ourselves from the land had this invention not happened. And it's extremely destructive as well, and really, really bad for topsoil, which probably should be one of the main issues we talk about when we talk about the environment's ability to continue sustaining human life. So the most recent mural I finished up is in a similar region out in Kingsport, Nova Scotia. Both of these projects were funded by Arts Nova Scotia. Thank you. So no matter where we live in North America, we rely on what happens in rural areas: resource extraction, farming, manufacturing, energy production. When it comes to food production, many of us outside of the ag industry are expanding our ideas about what it means to eat responsibly. So in making this work, I wanted to show a little gratitude for those who are making those decisions a reality for us. In this particular case with this barn, the first thing I did was ask the farmers if they had any topics that they thought were really important, or any stories or any pieces of equipment that they felt were, I barely got that out of my mouth when Jeff McMahon jumped at the chance to give me his input. Soil conservation, soil health is the most important thing. And interestingly enough, that was something that my father, who was a farmer and an educator, also talked a lot about at home. We're not allowed to call it dirt, it was soil. Anyway, long story short, this barn belongs to the McMahon family. And this farm, Longspell Point Farm, is the enterprise of Paula, Jeff, and Ben McMahon. And their farming practices reflect the belief that they are stewards of this land and the environment. And there's a lot of ways that they look after the health of their soil. And there's a lot to be said about soil conservation and the practices and technology that can be employed to ensure that the existence of healthy topsoil remains a reality for generations to come. Yeah, so if farming practices don't change, we may only have about 60 to 100 harvests left. There's the statistics, the data, the projections aren't very good. The text is borrowed from the 19th century motto of the Kings County Agricultural Society. Shown here out of its original context, I think it lends itself to a variety of interpretations, somewhere between being a message of hope and a warning. I imagine that no matter how a viewer reads and understands it, the motto and the imagery can hint at some of the threads between the past and our current realities. So if any of you out there in the Okanagan know of any sympathetic farmers with a barn in a viewable from a road, hook me up. I'll go anywhere. This is kind of what I want to do until I can't physically do it anymore. So to wrap up this little portion, because I still want to show you a thing or two in my studio. A few years ago, I started working on this series that I intended to finish at some point in the future when people stopped inviting me to participate in portfolio exchanges. And a portfolio exchange is when an artist curator invites a group of people, let's say 30 people, to make an edition of 30 about a particular theme. And it's a very particular size. And then all 30 of us artists make a piece of artwork about this theme and an edition of often 33, and we send it to the artist curator. And then they take them and they collate them all, and they send us back this beautiful box with 30 unique pieces of artwork in it. And they save a few for archives and exhibitions and traveling. So it's wonderful, right? Like you get an exhibition in a box. It happens every, I don't know, a couple times a year. I say yes to these things. And I kind of hate them because they're the wrong size. They don't fit well within the other work that I do. But I started doing this thing where I go out and I have a huge document full of language from these historic plaques in Nova Scotia. And I sort of pick and choose the language that I like. I kind of cherry pick little phrases and put them together like refrigerator poetry. And then I go out and take rubbings of them just with a little stick of graphite. I'll take 30 pieces of paper with me, often in the middle of winter, and I'll go take a rubbing of this text. And then I screen print on the back of the paper, or sometimes the front. So this piece I did in Texas, and the Perdido oil rig sits outside of Corpus Christi, Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico. And then this plaque here is this really distasteful plaque attempting to commemorate the Karankawa people that preceded settlement. And so I changed it around instead to say, Europeans gained a reputation for savagery, their population dwindled. So it's almost, well, I don't know. I'm kind of looking, when I'm going through all this text, I'm looking for that aha moment when something just feels right. And I had about 300 plaques to go through when I knew I wanted to round out this collection of rubbings for the show at the Kelowna Gallery. I gotta make at least 10 more of these. And then I'll edit it down, and then I'll have a nice exhibition. So I went through the language from all 300 plaques. And yeah, look for that aha moment when it just sort of clicked. There's a lot of material to work from. I like that they kind of deprive the monumental sentiment of its assuredness and maybe of power gently. And I'm trying to ride the line between appearing as if I'm being sincere, but actually being a bit cheeky in some of them as well. And I think others might be entirely sincere. Yeah. So you'll see in the exhibition, if you're able to go, that the text alludes to versions of history that either have not yet come to pass or that could be an account of the history of this continent in an alternative universe. So sometimes when I'm making the work, I'm imagining that I'm this like archaeologist, maybe thousands of years in the future, and I'm trying to piece together what the hell happened here based on these fractured plaques. So perhaps it's a reflection on the really subjective exercise of writing history. Or maybe musing about what it's like, what it could be like on this continent when patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism ultimately collapse. it's important to imagine. Sometimes it feels foolish to sort of roil around in that kind of exercise, especially when making visual art. But other times people tell us how our capacity to imagine is exactly what we need to harness if we want to move forward as humans. So what would our world look like if more humans lost interest in domination and dominion? So many of the images in this series are taken from really absurd moments in historical engravings during what was called the colonial era. A few of the images are things like people going over waterfalls and barrels, terrible and inaccurate depictions of what battles looked like, massive cities of hewn stone, severed heads, and a few contemporary images that propose logical extensions of this visual culture. So I hope that that project is ongoing. This is the first time where I've completed a series of work where drawing was not the central focus. And that was really interesting for me, and I think liberated me to do things and to play around in a way that I may not have otherwise. This piece is actually a collaboration with a student of mine from a couple of years ago, a graduating student at the time. I gave him my list of text, which at the time didn't include all 300 plaques, but I said, here's a couple thousand words that exist out there in bronze. And this is what I normally do. I kind of gave him the whole spiel. Like, what do you, it was a project. It was a portfolio exchange that I was invited to do with a student. Within 2 days, he came up with this, what I think is a really, really clever iteration of this work. Jordan Blackburn is his name. So, and then let me just... So there's a series I'm working on now, and I'm going to unplug my computer and show you up close one of these wood blocks. So this is an image of a wood block that's in process right now. There's eventually, hopefully, going to be 50 to 70 of them, and they are all different explosions through history since the arrival of my ancestors in America. So basically beginning from the American Revolution forward. And I'm going to call it the Heritage Collection or something cheeky like that. But it's basically kind of a gift or a reminder, maybe to my children, that yes, because I think they will have a really good life. I think they'll have a really privileged, comfortable life. And I want them to remember that also, part of your legacy and heritage is you are from a long line of people that blow things up. So let's not forget that. So some of them are photographs, historical photographs of events that happened. Others are historic engravings and woodcuts of images. This one particularly is blasting through mountainsides to put in a railway. And I think if I unhook myself, I'll show you one of these. Stop sharing. Okay. So there's 3 places where I make work. And the room that I'm in right now is, I guess it's my drawing studio. And this is in the upstairs of my house. And it's just a room devoted entirely to the clean work, to the drawing work. But I have these wood blocks up here right now, and they're just large pieces of birch plywood. This is actually, I'll show you here, this is how they started. So there's just like a gray ink that's kind of washed over the entire surface of the thing. And then I'll draw on it with marker and white chalk this sort of crude outline of photographic image, in this case of an airstrike over Vietnam from 1965. And so this one doesn't have any carving on it yet. But this one here is an image of the Trinity Test, actually. The first atomic test that was ever ever completed and ever successful. So if you look really closely, those of you that don't make prints, the black surface is left untouched, and all of these white lines are carved in. So if I run my fingernail across it, there's a texture here. And when you use I wish I could show you a roller. I know I have one somewhere. Well, this is a really itty bitty one. Hold on. A roller like this, but actually much, much larger. And if you think about like rolling that over the surface, you're going to hit all the high areas with the thin layer of ink that's on your roller, while it won't touch the areas that have been carved away. So you end up basically with a positive of what you have carved. And so this one gets a little more intense. This is an image also of no, actually this is napalm. This is napalm over Vietnam. A large portion of them will probably be images of airstrikes over Vietnam, because my father was directly involved in Operation Rolling Thunder, which was that gigantic mess. Many, many years of huge amounts of ordnance dropping on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So so that series is ongoing. I haven't printed any of them yet. It's just this carving exercise that I'm going through on a regular basis. It feels, I don't know, it feels very personal. It feels, when I'm doing these carvings, particularly because it requires a lot of interpretation of a photographic or previously drawn image into carving, which is not as direct as drawing. There's a kind of that transition, that translation is challenging, but also meditative and reflective, and almost like penance at times. It's hard to describe, but I know that the process is informing the way that the work will appear. And I think I've been talking for almost an hour. So what I can do is, I have some stuff to show you behind me. Why don't I show it? It's basically the way that the lithographs are made, or at least a portion of that. And I can show it if someone has a question, but otherwise I'll just kind of chill here on my floor and tackle any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ericka. That was just so cool. I really appreciate you sharing all of that wonderful information with us. Such a great, I don't even have words to describe how awesome that was just now. So thank you.
Welcome.
I mean, myself personally, coming from a military background, it really speaks depths to what I research as well. So thank you very much. So we will open up for chats, and we will open up for questions. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask Ericka, just type them into the chat bar there, and I will vocalize them for you, and we'll get you some answers.
Sounds good.
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, since it's also a studio tour, if it's technical, if it's personal, within reason, anything goes, really. I'm happy to answer anything. Yeah.
Oh, we've got a couple questions rolling in here. Question here from Teresa. She's asking, did the quote, "where the labor of centuries" come from Chernobyl? Have you done any work on the whole fiasco of Chernobyl?
Oh, no, I haven't. It may sound odd, but it's on, if I have a list of places that I'll probably never visit, or there's a list of a few places that out of, I think, professional curiosity, or maybe even morbid curiosity, just have a strong desire to visit parts of Russia, particularly Chernobyl. But no, I haven't made any work about it. The phrase from that poster, it's funny because you know, a lot of you will notice that labor is spelled there with just the O, which now looks awkward to me. I've been I've been here, I guess, long enough that color with just one O looks weird now. I don't know if that's a special transition or what, but the text came from it was a series of advertisements, kind of little magazine-sized propaganda from World War II, about kind of warning people about just about German influence. I think they referred to it as Prussianism, and they talked about, you know, the violation of the land, and how important land was, and how Prussianism was threatening that, and where the labor of centuries had made the land to smile was the reference to this land that we must protect. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I guess you'll have to add Chernobyl to your list of projects to work towards.
I have to add the Halifax explosion now too, which I guess is more obvious, but it was a question from another talk I did a couple weeks ago, where someone pointed that out to me, like, well, if you're doing all these explosions through history that are part of your, you know, your predecessors' responsibilities, I think you got to tackle that one. So yeah, they're totally right.
For sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Got another question here from Tim. They're asking, will this new series of woodcuts feature historically sourced text as well?
Yes, actually. How did you know that? No. So the part I didn't mention that is I think a new development for me is the text will be on separate pieces of wood, same size, but I'm going to attempt to transcribe a large part of a story written by this guy named Ambrose Bierce, who was an American journalist. He was one of those sort of Renaissance people, and he wrote this story about a battle called the Battle of Chickamauga. And I've read the story 20 times. It makes me upset, to put it mildly. It's very upsetting, but it strikes a chord that, even though it was written in 1869, it is true for me today. And it's about that legacy that I kind of mentioned, and something I want my child or children to know about. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be accompanying those explosions. Yeah.
Cool. Our very own Natalie here, our executive director, is thanking you. She says, thank you so much for this, Ericka. It was an excellent experience and learning opportunity. So great to see you in your studio. I've got a question here from Maria. She says, great talk, Ericka. Thank you. Could you go over the posters in your studio and talk a bit about the lithography process?
Sure. So the lithography process, to put it very simply, I'm just going to pretend that it's the first time I'm explaining it to my mom. It originated by drawing, there's a very, very pure, very dense kind of limestone that comes from a special quarry in Solnhofen. It's Bavarian limestone, and you can basically machine it so that it's perfectly flat and even, and it's absorbent. If you draw on it with a greasy substance, you get a drawing that looks like a charcoal drawing or a Conte crayon drawing, and there's things you can do with brushes and washes, so you could get a very autographic mark. And then if you take a very simple mixture of chemicals and kind of massage it onto the surface of this stone, you get a you fix the image into the stone, basically change the chemical compound on that very thin surface of the stone. And so that when you get the surface of the stone wet with a water, like with a sponge full of water, part of the image area will become water loving and part of the image will become grease loving. So if you keep it wet and roll a greasy ink over the surface, it sticks to the image area and is repelled by the watery area. So you end up, it solved a lot of, in the really early 19th century, this process was perfected and it solved a lot of problems that other printmaking processes couldn't do. Like you couldn't just sit someone down in front of an etching or engraving plate or even a woodcut and say, okay, do this, artists make these marks. Like you have to really train to do those things fairly well. But you can give anyone a piece of a greasy crayon or a wash and say, this is like, just do your thing, make your mark. And it will translate if you know what you're doing with the chemicals and all these other parts of the process, which are much more complicated than I've described. You get, this reproduction of your drawing. Fast forward hundreds of years, we can now do this process on aluminum plates and not on lithographic stones, although many of us still use these big stones. We have a wonderful collection here at NASCAD. Some really amazing historical works have been made on them, and they're gorgeous and huge, which is also rare to have such large lithographic stones. But and photomechanical processes work really well with this process as well. So behind me, basically what this is, I'll just get real close. Do you see the image here? This figure on the top is screen printed. So that I can just remove. This will make it a little easier to understand. So that is all lithographic. And what that came from was this set of drawings that's behind me. And so there's about six films here, which means that there were 6 layers of that print. So it went through a printing press 6 times. So this image here on the top is a key drawing, which means it has the most information. I usually start with this. I'll start with this image and then start to draw the other layers, knowing that, for instance, this layer that I'm drawing on this clear film is going to be for the red in the text. And so on. So here's the light gray or the dark gray. And this is the image that will be for the light gray. So what's significant about these films is that all the drawing that is on the surface of them is essentially opaque. It's like a black fluid, like a black gesso that's been painted onto the surface of these translucent or transparent films. Or a black colored pencil. What else could you use? India ink, crayon, China marker, anything that's essentially going to block light. So that when I take this film and I sandwich it really tightly with one of those aluminum plates that we now can use instead of a big stone, if I sandwich them really tightly in a vacuum table and shine a light onto the surface of that aluminum plate, since it has a thin film of photochemicals on it, I'm burning my image into that metal plate that I then sponge it up with water, ink it up with that greasy ink, and run it through a lithographic press. So all of these works end up I get to mess around with them in my studio for sometimes weeks, a month or so, just as these drawings on films. And I get to play around with them as these black and white images that are, abstracted in a way from what the original will look like. And I use things like Photoshop or Illustrator to photograph the drawing on the film, like the sandwich of drawings, and then play around with color to try to make decisions about the composition that way. Yeah. Yeah. That's the quickest version of that I have, I think.
It sounds like a lengthy process. But yeah, just so detailed and so incredible. And the fact that you can make multiples afterwards, I guess it's worth it, worth all the work at the end, right?
I mean, that's a big draw. That's a really big draw, is the ability to have multiples. I remember that as a younger student, thinking like, oh, that's great. You don't have to part with this one thing. Like, I get to keep one. More people could access it. They're not as expensive, maybe, so more people can collect them. But it also really, it kind of limits me in this way that I actually find really beneficial, really productive. You know, I know that I'm not going to do, I think it's rare for me to do that many plates, to do that many colors. Like, I could probably have done more with three films or with 3 plates than 6 if I had stretched my brain enough. Because you can get pretty inventive with how you use each layer really sparingly. And I think it creates, it makes a certain kind of decision making really prominent in our heads when we are thinking through all those processes and making work. I think some folks that don't do it, would find it maybe stifling. And it can be, especially when you're a student, like when you have to wade through all that crap. But the more familiar and comfortable you become with it, actually opens up a lot of possibilities. And it alters your brain and the way you think about solving visual problems. It's kind of, I guess I really like it. I hope so.
Awesome. So I'll end off with one question here from my coworker, Josh. And he says he noticed that you appear to include a screen print of the Death Star in one of your works. Is there a special place in your heart for Star Wars? Also, are you Empire or Rebellion? Also, yesterday was Star Wars Day, so I have to ask this question.
Oh, I love that you posted that. Someone from the gallery posted that on
That
Instagram.
was Josh.
Oh, Josh. Thank you. So with that particular piece, the text came before the image. Sometimes with some of this work, the image comes first. Sometimes it's the text. But with that one, I think that I know the text was first. I think that one might have been my husband. So credit where it's due, man. But I do have a very special relationship with Star Wars. I was born in 81, so I have, I was a child when the Empire Strikes Back came out, and I have one of my most prized possessions is an Ewok doll made by Hasbro. It's probably worth like thousands of dollars. But yes, to keep it simple. But I think when I was going through, I had this bank of images that I wanted to use for that series. And the Death Star, I don't think was one of them at the time, but I brought my husband up into my studio and I said, what do you think about this one? And I think he said that, I think that has to be the Death Star. I wish I had an image of it I could just easily pull up, but I don't. And the Empire Rebellion, I can't answer that. Depends on the year of my life that we're talking about.
Depends on the day.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions. And thank you for the amazing tour and talk. And honestly, it related into a lot of our current programming that's happening with our other current exhibition, Bombhead.
Yes.
So yeah, make sure you take a look at that. And there's a lot of awesome connections that I think could be made between your work and that collection on display.
Well, I wish I could see it in person. It's just a tremendous exhibition. Yeah, I'll check out I'll come to some of those talks. I'm excited.
Yeah, please do. We have another one happening on May 20th. So if you're around and it's not too late, your time, feel free to check it out. But as always, everything will be posted up on our website at a later date.
I love it. That's great. Thank you so much for all the programming that you do and taking such good care of me from afar.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ericka. And hopefully we will talk again soon.